The doors opened without warning. Nobody knocked. Nobody announced. They just opened. And every man in that room went still. Selim Virex didn't look up right away. That was the thing about real power, it never moved fast. He sat behind a desk that cost more than most people's houses. A glass of red wine balanced between two fingers, the gold light from the windows cutting across his face like something carved from judgment. The room smelled like leather and silence. The kind of silence that told you, without a single word, that whoever sat in that chair decided things. Final things. The kind of things that didn't get reversed. His guards were positioned at 3 points in the room. Trained men. Expensive men. Men who had seen enough in this line of work that almost nothing made them flinch anymore. Almost. Because when the doors opened and the figure walked in, alone, unhurried, dressed in a clean dark suit like he hadn't just walked into the most dangerous room in the city, every single one of them shifted. Not dramatically, just enough. A hand moved closer to a holster. A shoulder squared. Two men near the back exchanged a glance that lasted less than a second. Selim noticed all of it. He set the wine glass down. Hi viewers, have you ever trusted someone so completely that when they disappeared, you didn't even question why? Drop your answer in the comments. I'm genuinely curious. The man walking toward the desk wasn't rushing. That was the first thing. People who came into this office with bad news rushed, stumbled over words, kept their eyes down, tried to make themselves smaller. People who came in owing something moved carefully, measuring every step like the floor might disappear beneath them. This man didn't do either. He walked the way someone walks when they have already decided how this moment ends. Selim's jaw didn't tighten. His eyes didn't narrow. But something in his chest, deep, structural, like a wall that hadn't moved in years, shifted 1 inch. Because he recognized the walk before he recognized the face. Niren. The name didn't come out loud. It didn't need to. It moved through Selim's mind like a current, fast, cold, and gone just as quickly. He kept his expression exactly where it was. Neutral, controlled, present. Niren stopped at the edge of the desk. He didn't speak. He never spoke. Not in any way anyone in this room could hear. But that wasn't weakness. That had never been weakness. It was something else. Something that had always made the men around Selim uncomfortable in ways they couldn't explain. He placed the briefcase on the desk. One smooth motion. No hesitation. The sound it made, that low, solid click of leather meeting polished wood, hit the room like a stone dropped into still water. Every guard heard it. Every guard recognized it. Because that briefcase had been missing for 5 years. And the man who was supposed to be gone, gone in the way that people in this world went gone, was standing here, alive, calm, and waiting. Selim looked at the briefcase. He looked at it for 3 full seconds. Then he looked at Niren. And for the first time in years, years of controlled boardrooms and calculated silences and decisions made without blinking, something moved behind his eyes. Not guilt. Not yet. Something older than guilt. Recognition. One of the guards stepped forward. Selim raised 1 finger. The guard stopped. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Selim reached forward. His hand rested on the top of the briefcase, not opening it yet, just feeling the weight of it, the realness of it. Where did you get this? His voice was low. Not a question. Barely a sentence. Just sound shaped into something that expected an answer. Niren didn't move. He just looked at Selim with eyes that held no anger, no fear, no urgency. Eyes that had clearly been through something, and come out the other side carrying something heavier than emotion. The gold light from the windows fell across both of them. Neither blinked. Selim's fingers pressed down on the briefcase clasps. He opened it, and the room, the entire controlled, powerful, untouchable room, went quiet in a way it had never been quiet before. because whatever Selim saw inside that case made every muscle in his face shift at once. Not dramatically, not loudly, just enough for anyone watching closely to understand. This changed something. This changed everything. So here's the question. If someone you trusted disappeared 5 years ago and walked back in today with proof of what really happened, what would your first reaction be? Anger? Relief? Or something you can't even name yet? Tell me in the comments. Because this story is about to go somewhere none of us expected. The documents were organized. That was the first thing Selim noticed. Not randomly thrown together. Not desperate proof assembled in a hurry. Every page was ordered, dated, labeled, like someone had spent years getting this exactly right. He lifted the first file. Timestamps. Internal communications. Authorization codes that could only have come from inside his own operation. Every piece cross-referenced. Every claim backed by something else. This wasn't testimony. This wasn't someone's word against another. This was architecture. Somebody had built this case the way an engineer builds a bridge, piece by piece, bearing the weight, testing every joint before moving to the next one. Selim read without looking up. His face stayed even. His breathing stayed even. But his grip on the edge of the file tightened slightly. The first document outlined the original incident. The briefcase, the missing intelligence files, the window of opportunity. Selim already knew this part. He had lived this part. What he didn't know was what was written in the margin of page 3, initialed by a name he recognized. Not Niren's name, someone else's. He kept reading. The second file was communications. Internal. Encrypted. The kind of messages that weren't supposed to exist outside the system that generated them. And yet here they were, printed real, sitting in a briefcase that a man who should have been dead just walked in and placed on his desk. The most dangerous lies aren't told loudly. They're signed quietly and trusted blindly. Page 7. A directive. Dated 5 years ago. 2 days before the incident. The directive outlined a setup. Step by step. Clean. No fingerprints on the surface. Someone had known exactly how Selim's mind worked. How he processed information, how he reacted to threat, what logic he would follow when pressure arrived. They had designed the whole thing around his predictability. And it had worked. Selim set that file down. Picked up the next one. Third file. Financial records. Movement of funds through 3 separate accounts in the 48 hours surrounding the incident. Funds that were later recovered from a location that had nothing to do with Niren. And everything to do with someone who had walked into this office every single week for 5 years without raising a single alarm. Selim finally looked up. Niren was still standing exactly where he'd been. Same posture. Same expression. Same unbothered stillness that had always made people around him feel like they were being read. He wasn't gloating. That was the part that settled into Selim's chest like cold water. There was no satisfaction in Niren's face. No triumph. No told you so waiting behind his eyes. Just presence. Just patience. The kind that only develops in people who have had nothing to do for years except wait for the right moment. Selim looked back down at the files. He went through 4 more pages without speaking. His mind was already moving, already cross-referencing, already mapping the implications, already doing what it always did when a new piece of information arrived. Building a complete picture from fragments. And the picture it was building right now was not a comfortable one. Because if these documents were real, and every instinct Selim had, every instinct he'd built over a decade of reading people and situations in power, told him they were, then the decision he had made 5 years ago wasn't just wrong. It was engineered. He had been steered, carefully, deliberately, by someone close enough to know his habits and patient enough to wait for the right moment to use them. He closed the 3rd file, opened the 4th. More communications, different timestamps, a thread that showed coordination happening not just before the incident, but after. Someone monitoring the fallout. Someone making sure Niren stayed gone. making sure the story stayed clean. The anger came quietly. Not explosive. Selim didn't do explosive. It arrived the way a tidal shift arrives. Invisible on the surface, total underneath. Pressure change. A reorientation of everything. He straightened up in his chair. His eyes moved across the faces in the room. His guards. His men. Men he had trusted with different levels of access, different levels of responsibility, different levels of his actual world. He studied them the way he studied documents, systematically, without giving away what he was looking for. One face. It lasted less than a second. An adjustment of expression that didn't quite match the moment. A micro-shift behind the eyes that happened right when Selim's gaze passed over the financial records. Selim didn't stop on that face. He moved on, looked at the next man, then the window, then back to Niren. How long did this take you? Still not a question. His voice had gone quieter. That was the tell. When Selim's voice dropped, the room got more dangerous, not less. Niren reached into his jacket pocket. He placed one more file on top of the others, smaller than the rest. Just a few pages. But the name on the cover tab, typed clean, sitting right there in plain sight, made the temperature in the room drop 3 degrees. Selim recognized the name, and the worst part was he wasn't completely surprised. He should have been. He wanted to be. But somewhere at the back of everything, beneath all the logic and control and years of telling himself the decision had been necessary, there had always been a thread he chose not to pull. He was pulling it now. The most dangerous people in your life are never strangers. They're the ones close enough to know exactly which lever to pull. Have you ever found out someone you trusted was working against you the whole time? What did that feel like? Tell me below. 5 years ago, the office looked exactly the same. Same gold light, same desk, same controlled silence that Selim had spent years building into the walls of this room. But 5 years ago, there were more voices, more movement. The kind of energy that existed before everything got simplified down to survival. Niren had been standing almost exactly where he stood now. But 5 years ago, he wasn't calm. He was still. There was a difference. Back then, the stillness was effort, the kind of stillness that came from choosing not to react when every instinct was screaming. 5 years ago, Niren's hands had been clasped in front of him, and there was something in his posture that Selim had read as composure but now understood was something else entirely. It was absorption. He had been absorbing the moment, taking it in completely, deciding how to carry it. Selim had stood at the window, back turned, which was something he almost never did. That choice was its own language. It meant he had already decided. It meant this was announcement, not conversation. 3 of his men were in the room. Vale, who ran communications. Dorian, head of security. And one other. The name was right there in the edge of Selim's memory now, sharp and unpleasant, because that name was on the tab of the last file Niren had placed on the desk. Someone had presented the case against Niren with clean logic and clean evidence. The briefcase had been in Niren's section. The window of opportunity was his. The timeline matched his movements. Everything fit. Selim had always been proud of his ability to make decisions without sentiment. Pride. The thing that made you blind to exactly what it was supposed to sharpen you against. He had turned from the window and said 4 words. Handle it. No noise. That was it. He hadn't looked at Niren when he said it. The not looking was the part that lived in the back of his chest now, pressing there quietly, like a splinter he'd never removed. He told himself at the time that looking wouldn't change anything. That sentiment was a liability. That in this world, hesitation cost more than mistakes. What he hadn't admitted, not to himself, not to anyone, was that he hadn't looked because some part of him already doubted. And looking at Niren's face would have meant acknowledging the doubt. And acknowledging the doubt would have meant slowing down. And slowing down would have meant following a thread that someone very smart had worked very hard to make sure he never followed. So he hadn't looked. and Niren had been taken. No protest, no struggle, no attempt to speak, which in retrospect should have told Selim something, because the people who were actually guilty always tried to talk their way out. Always. Even when there was no way out, they talked. They filled the silence with noise because noise felt like action. Niren had gone quiet. Not defeated quiet, decided quiet, like someone who had already assessed the situation, understood that arguing would change nothing, and chosen instead to file the moment away somewhere deep and permanent. Sometimes the worst betrayal isn't action. It's hesitation. Back in the present, Selim leaned back in his chair. The memory settled over the room like something physical. He could almost feel the edges of it. The specific texture of a choice made too fast, for the wrong reasons, based on information that had been placed in front of him by someone who knew exactly how he made decisions. He looked at Niren now, and Niren was looking back. Not with hatred, not with grief, with something that was much harder to be in the room with. Understanding. Complete, clear, and patient understanding. The kind that said, I know exactly what happened. I know exactly why you chose what you chose. I know the pressure you were under. I know the logic you used. And I survived it anyway. That was the thing sitting in Niren's eyes right now. Not I forgive you. Not I hate you. Just I lived through what you decided. And I'm still here. And you have to look at me. Selim held the eye contact. He didn't look away this time. The gold light held them both. The guards in the room didn't exist. The documents on the desk didn't exist. The name on that last file tab, the name that was going to change things significantly in the next few minutes, didn't exist yet. There was just this moment of two people in a room, 5 years of distance between them, and a truth that had finally stopped being a secret. Selim exhaled slowly, not loud, just enough. And Niren, for the first time since he walked through those doors, blinked. If someone came back into your life with proof that you wronged them, and you knew they were telling the truth, could you look them in the eye? Think about that, because what Selim is about to find out next is going to cost him a lot more than an apology. Nobody came for Niren. That was the part people never understood about this kind of world. When someone got removed, got quietly taken out of a situation and dropped somewhere far from where the power lived, there was an assumption that someone would come, that the truth would surface fast, that silence only lasted so long before it broke. It didn't break. Nobody came. No rescue. No second look at the evidence. No one in Selim's circle who cared enough or doubted enough or had enough to lose by asking the wrong questions out loud. Niren had been discarded. Not hidden. Not held. Discarded the way you discard something you've already stopped thinking about. Dropped into a city 3 hours away with nothing but what he'd been wearing. Left alive only because dead men sometimes created questions and questions created noise. And the people who engineered this whole situation were very specifically in the business of avoiding noise. They had underestimated one thing. Quiet people have the most patience. The first year was survival, raw, practical, unglamorous. No one from his old life. No resources. No connections that hadn't been severed. Just observation. Just watching how the city around him worked, who answered to who, where money moved and why. Niren had always been good at reading rooms. Discarded and anonymous, he had an entire city to read. The second year, patterns emerged. He started to understand the structures, not just street level but higher up. How information traveled. Which systems talked to each other. Which people were positioned in ways that gave them access to things they were never officially supposed to access. He took notes. Not literally at first, he carried everything in his head, because paper created evidence and evidence created risk. But he organized it. Categorized it, built a mental architecture of everything he was learning. By the third year, he had something, a thread. It started with a financial movement he'd noticed, a routing pattern that showed up twice in different contexts, connected to different names but carrying the same invisible signature. Most people would have missed it. Niren had time. Niren had nothing but time and a very specific reason to pay attention. He pulled the thread. Slowly. Carefully. With the kind of patience that only exists in people who have stopped being in a hurry because they understand that rushing gets you discovered, and getting discovered ends everything. The thread led to a name. The name led to records. The records led to a picture so complete and so damning that when Niren finally held the full documentation in his hands, he sat with it for 3 days before deciding what to do next. He could have gone to external authorities. He could have sent it anonymously. He could have used it as leverage in a dozen different directions. He brought it back here. That decision was its own statement. Not loud. Niren didn't do loud, but clear, precise. Like everything else he had done in the last 5 years, chosen deliberately with full understanding of what it meant. He was not broken. That was the part that Selim needed to understand, and that the room needed to understand, and that the man whose name sat on that last file tab most certainly needed to understand. Niren had come back not because he needed something from this world. He had come back because this world still had an outstanding balance, and he was the one holding the account. Pain didn't break him. It organized him. Isolation didn't hollow him out. It sharpened him. The men who left him with nothing had accidentally given him the one thing that made him more dangerous than anything in that room. They'd given him 5 years with nothing to do but think. And now he was back. Standing in front of the man who had let it happen. Carrying the receipts. Selim could feel it, the shift in weight between them. It wasn't dramatic. No one watching from outside would have seen it. But power had a texture, and the texture in this room right now was different from the texture that had existed an hour ago. He thought about what it would have taken. The discipline, the precision, the patience required to spend 5 years building something like this. Without support, without resources, without anyone knowing what you were doing or why. He reached forward and touched the edge of the final file. The name on the tab stared back at him. Clear. Specific. Waiting. He looked up. Niren was watching him again. And Niren slowly reached into the file without breaking eye contact and slid one specific page forward. A single communication. Time-stamped. Signed. Selim read it. And then he knew for certain exactly who in this room had built the trap that swallowed 5 years of both their lives. So here's what I need to know. When you've been wronged by someone close to you, which do you choose? Revenge? Proof? Or silence? Because Niren chose something that most people never think of. And the man standing behind Selim right now is about to find out exactly what that choice costs. Selim didn't look up immediately. He read the page a second time. Not because he'd missed anything. He'd understood it completely on the first pass. He read it again because the second time was for control. For making sure that when he lifted his eyes, his face was exactly what he needed it to be. Even, settled, present. He raised his head. The room looked the same as it always did. His guards positioned the same way they always were. The gold light from the windows, the desk, the files spread across it like a map of 5 lost years. But now he was looking at every face differently. He didn't move to the name on the file tab right away. That would have been too obvious, and obvious gave people time to prepare. Instead, he let his eyes drift across the room in a slow, methodical sweep. The way he looked at financial reports. The way he read a room before making a decision. Like he was simply thinking. He wasn't thinking. He was watching. The man's name was Elric Devon. 7 years in Selim's inner circle. Sharp, reliable, the kind of person who never overstepped and never needed to be asked twice. The kind of person whose competence made him easy to stop questioning. Selim had stopped questioning Elric Devon a long time ago, which was, as the documents now made devastatingly clear, exactly what Devon had counted on. His position in the room was near the left wall. Arms crossed, expression neutral. But when Selim's gaze passed across the financial page, The page with the routing pattern, the account signature, the trail that Niren had spent years following back to its source. There it was. Not panic. Not guilt. Nothing so readable. Just a single, small, involuntary tightening of the jaw. Gone in under a second. But Selim saw it. He always saw things like that. He had built an entire empire on seeing things like that. He looked back at the documents. Set the page down. Aligned the edges of the files carefully. A habit, something his hands did when his mind was moving fast and he needed the surface around him to stay ordered. Power doesn't collapse from enemies. It collapses from trust placed in the wrong hands. He understood that more right now than he ever had before. He did not raise his voice. He didn't call Devon out by name in front of the room. He didn't make it a spectacle. That was for people who needed the release of drama. People who let their emotions run the moment instead of running it themselves. Instead, he simply said, quietly, to his head of security, "Pull Devon's access. All of it. Now." Pause. Then, and remove him from the building. Not a shout. Not an accusation. Just a direction, delivered with the same register he used to approve budgets and close acquisitions. The silence that followed was immediate. Devon didn't make a scene. Maybe he knew it was over. Maybe he had always known this moment was somewhere on the timeline, had just been hoping the timeline was longer. He straightened up slowly, uncrossed his arms, and walked toward the door flanked by two men who had moved before the sentence was even finished. He didn't speak. He didn't look at Niren. That was telling. When the door closed, the room reset. Still gold. Still quiet. But different now, the way a room feels after a window that's been cracked for years finally gets sealed. Something was fixed. But fixing it didn't bring back what the crack had already let in. Selim looked at Niren. Niren was watching the door. He turned back to Selim slowly. His expression had not changed. Not when the name was identified. Not when the order was given. Not when Devon walked out. Not a flicker of relief. Not a trace of satisfaction. That was what stayed with Selim. He had expected something. Some small release of what 5 years of carrying this must have felt like. Some acknowledgement that it was over. There was nothing. Because for Niren, this wasn't the ending of something. It was just a step. The traitor being removed was justice in the most mechanical sense. The right person held accountable. The system corrected. But there was a second debt in this room. And it had nothing to do with Elric Devon. Selim felt it settle over him. The files were still spread across his desk. The briefcase was still sitting there, returned after everything. 5 years of silence. 5 years of someone surviving something that should have ended them, surviving it alone, building something out of nothing, and walking back through those doors not for revenge but for something far more precise. Truth. And the truth now sat between them in a way that removing Devon didn't fix. Selim exhaled. "Sit down," he said. And then, quieter, not a command, barely even a request, he added, "Please." Niren looked at him. Didn't move. Didn't sit. Just looked. And in that look was a question that hadn't been asked out loud, but was sitting in the center of the room like the most important thing anyone had said all afternoon. Why would I? Power can remove a traitor in 60 seconds. Cannot undo 5 years of silence in 60 seconds. So here is the real question. If you were Niren, would you sit down? Would any part of you still trust the man who let it happen? Drop your answer below. Because what Niren does next is going to surprise you. And it won't look anything like what you're expecting. He was gone in under 4 minutes. That was the thing about real power, it didn't need a scene. Elric Devon walked out of that office. The door closed behind him, and the room simply continued. No raised voices. No chaos. No dramatic confrontation where someone pointed a finger and the whole system cracked open. Just a quiet order. And then it was done. Selim stood up from behind the desk for the first time since Niren had walked in. He moved to the window, Not the same way he'd moved to it 5 years ago, with his back turned and his decision already made. This time he faced it directly, looked out at the city below. The skyline doing what it always did, indifferent, enormous, carrying on with no awareness of what had just shifted in this room. He stayed there for a moment. Then he turned back. The guards had repositioned after Devon's removal. Fewer people now. The room had a different shape to it. Not smaller, but more defined. Like something that had been cluttered for years had finally been cleared. Nyron was still standing where he'd been. He hadn't taken the seat Selim had offered. Hadn't moved toward the window. Hadn't shifted his weight or relaxed his posture or done any of the things a person does when a situation resolves. Because for him, it hadn't resolved. Selim removing Devon was correct. It was necessary. It was what should have happened. But necessary doesn't mean complete. Selim looked at him. It's handled, he said. Nyron didn't react. That was the part. Right there. That was the piece Selim hadn't been prepared for. That doing the right thing after the fact would land with this much silence. He had expected something. Not gratitude. He wasn't naive enough to expect gratitude. But some form of acknowledgement. Some signal that the correction registered. Nothing. Nyron's eyes were on the desk. On the files. On the briefcase sitting at the edge of it like a period at the end of a sentence that had taken 5 years to write. Selim tried again. Devon won't surface. The accounts will be traced and closed. The people below him who executed the original setup. I'll find them. Still nothing. Quiet power is supposed to feel like control. Right now it felt like standing in an empty building after everyone has already left. Selim had corrected the system. He had done what good leadership demanded. Identified the source, removed it cleanly, without noise or performance. He had exercised the kind of authority that built empires and maintained them. He had done everything right. And yet, Nyron stood there like none of it touched him. Because it didn't. Justice, real justice, the kind that shows up 5 years late in a briefcase carried by a man who survived by his own resources alone. Doesn't feel like resolution when it arrives. It feels like confirmation of something you already knew. The proof doesn't heal anything. It just makes the record accurate. Selim understood that now. The record was accurate. And the wound was still exactly where it had always been. He walked back toward the desk. Didn't sit. Stood at the edge of it, facing Nyron across a distance that wasn't just physical. You built that entire case alone, he said. Not a question. Just a statement. Said the way someone speaks when they're trying to understand the actual size of something. Nyron glanced at him. Looked away. 5 years, Selim said. Quieter now. Nobody helped you. The gold light held both of them in it. No answer came. No answer was needed. Because the files on the desk answered it. Every page, every timestamp, every cross-reference document assembled with the kind of precision that only exists in a person who has nothing to fall back on except their own mind. Selim set both hands on the edge of the desk. I removed him, he said. The system is corrected. A pause. That's not enough. He said it like someone pulling a splinter out. Slow, specific, a little late. Nyron's head turned toward him. Fraction of a second. Then turned away again. And that tiny, almost invisible movement told Selim everything he needed to know about where they actually were. Because the look wasn't anger. It wasn't grief. It was unimpressed. Like someone who had heard better. Like someone who had decided a long time ago not to measure anything by what powerful people said they would do. Only by what they actually did. And what Selim had actually done 5 years ago was the only thing that mattered now. The traitor was gone. The room was cleaner. But quiet power is only impressive when it moves in the right direction at the right time. 5 years ago it hadn't. And removing Devon today didn't rewrite that. It just added one correct line to a record that was still deeply, significantly wrong. I was wrong. 3 words. Selim said them the way a man says something he's been carrying for a long time. Not dramatically, not with relief, just directly. Like setting something heavy down on a table. Here it is. I know what it is. I'm not pretending otherwise. The room had cleared by now. 2 guards remained near the door. Far enough that conversation at the desk was private. Close enough that the room wasn't empty. Selim hadn't dismissed them deliberately. He'd just stopped noticing them. Niren was still standing. He looked at Selim when the words came. Held the look for a beat. Then his eyes moved to the window. Selim didn't fill the silence right away. He waited. That was something he was actually good at. He understood that rushing to explain an apology was the same as taking it back. So he stood with the words in the space between them and let them sit. I had the evidence in front of me, he continued. Or I thought I did. What Devon gave me was constructed well enough that it fit the pattern I was already looking for. I moved too fast. He paused. I didn't ask enough questions. Niren's jaw shifted. Just slightly. Almost nothing. Selim kept going. I also didn't look at you when I gave the order. That was the harder one. He said it without looking away. That was deliberate. And I knew it at the time. I chose not to look because looking would have slowed me down. He exhaled. And slowing down was what I should have done. Apologies don't heal what abandonment creates. They only acknowledge it. Niren's hands were at his sides. Still. Controlled. The same controlled stillness he'd walked in with. And Selim was starting to understand now that the stillness wasn't something Niren had always had. It was something that had been built. Layer by layer. In the absence of anyone who showed up. I can account for what happened, Selim said. The logic I followed. The pressure the syndicate was under at that time. What a compromise in that briefcase would have meant. He stopped himself. Because that was the part where an apology became an explanation. And an explanation became, quietly, a justification. And he wasn't here for justification. None of that changes what the decision cost you. He said that flatly. No softness around it. Just the fact of it sitting there. Niren finally moved. Not toward Selim. Not dramatically. He took 3 steps to the side, following the edge of the room, and stopped near the bookcase on the left wall. His back wasn't fully to Selim, it was angled, like someone who wasn't ready to face the conversation directly, but wasn't walking away from it either. Selim watched him. He noticed the slight tension in Niren's shoulders. The way his fingers moved once, barely, against his side. The way his chin dropped just a fraction of an inch before coming back up. These were not the movements of someone who was unmoved. These were the movements of someone who was working very hard to stay exactly as moved as they had decided to let themselves be. Selim understood that kind of control. He lived in it. He knew what it cost to maintain it. And he understood that Niren's distance right now wasn't indifference. It was self-protection. 5 years of building walls doesn't come undone because someone finally says the right words. The walls had been built for a reason. They had kept him alive. They had kept him functional. They were structural, not decorative. I'm not asking you to accept the apology, Selim said. Niren's head turned slightly, listening. I'm telling you that I know what I did. And I'm telling you that I know that knowing it changes nothing for you. A pause. It changes something for me. Another pause. Longer. But I understand that's not your problem. Niren turned fully toward him then. And the look on his face, the first fully readable expression he'd worn since walking through those doors, was something Selim filed away and knew he would carry for a long time. Because it wasn't anger. It wasn't acceptance. It wasn't even grief. It was exhaustion. The specific kind of exhaustion that comes not from effort, but from waiting. From being owed something for so long that the debt itself starts to feel like a weight that belongs to you. From carrying proof of someone else's mistake until your arms are tired and your back hurts and you're not even sure anymore whether returning it will make you feel lighter or just emptier. Selim looked at him, said nothing for a moment, then, "Stay." Just that word. No command in it. No authority. No weight of power or position or the fact that this was his building and his room and his world that Niren had walked back into. Just the word, offered quietly, like a door left open, not pushed. And Niren stood there, in the gold light, in the silence, with 5 years of his own life arranged in a briefcase on that desk behind them. And he didn't answer. Not yet. He didn't sit down right away. That mattered. The chair was right there. The one across from Selim's desk. The one that had held lieutenants and partners and people who carried weight in this world. It sat empty. And Niren looked at it the way someone looks at something they've been offered that they're not ready to take yet. He walked. Not nervously. Not pacing. Just moving through the room the way someone moves when they're thinking, when the body needs to be doing something so the mind can work freely. He went to the bookcase first. Ran his eyes across the spines of things there without touching them. Then to the side table near the window. Then back toward the center. Selim didn't speak. He watched. And something he hadn't done in years, in this room with this desk between him and whoever he was dealing with, he waited without directing. He let someone else move at their own pace. He removed himself from control of the moment and just held still. That was harder than removing Devon. Significantly harder. Niren stopped near the right side of the room. Looked at the wall. One of Selim's acquisition maps was framed there. Territories, connections, resource lines. The kind of thing that told the story of an empire in visual shorthand. He studied it. Selim watched him study it. And Selim realized, with the specific clarity of something you should have seen a long time ago, that Niren was doing the same thing he'd been doing for 5 years. Reading a system. Understanding how something was structured. Finding where the weight was distributed and where the gaps were. He was standing in it the way someone stands when they're assessing whether it's worth their time. That landed differently than Selim expected. It landed like respect. The complicated kind, the kind that acknowledges you've been outgrown. Niren walked back toward the desk. He pulled the chair out. Didn't sit in the one beside Selim's position, the one that signaled proximity, alliance, support. He took the one directly across. The one where, for every meeting in this room over the last decade, whoever sat there was on the receiving end of something. An offer, condition, a judgment. He sat in it like he owned it. Back straight, eyes forward, hands on the armrests. And the room, the geometry of it, changed completely. Not Selim's room now. Not a meeting between power and a person trying to reclaim something. 2 people, across a desk. Neither one above the other. Selim felt it. He would have been lying if he said he didn't. There was something disorienting about it. Not uncomfortable, exactly. Just unfamiliar. He had sat behind that desk for so long, with everyone else sitting lower or standing, that having someone across from him who carried equal weight in the air was a completely different experience. He didn't adjust his position. He let it be. "You're not going to make this easy," Selim said. Not a complaint. Almost a statement of admiration. Niren looked at him, held it. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and placed something small on the desk between them. A key. Old. Heavy. The kind attached to a specific kind of secure case. Selim looked at it. Looked up at Niren. "There's a second briefcase," Selim said slowly. "You held something back." Niren didn't confirm. Didn't deny. Just held the eye contact with the kind of patience that says, "Figure it out. You're smart enough. Figure it out." And Selim figured it out. The first briefcase was the proof. The documentation. The case that exposed Devon and corrected the official record and gave Selim what he needed to clean his own house. The key was different. The key was leverage. Whatever was in the second case, Niren had kept it separate. Not as a weapon, necessarily. Not as a threat. But as insurance. As a boundary. As the specific, wordless way of saying, I returned what belonged to you. But I didn't return everything. Because everything would mean trust. And trust is not where we are yet. This wasn't forgiveness. This was terms. Niren's eyes stayed on him. Selim looked at the key. Then he slowly reached across and pushed it back toward Niren. Keep it, he said. Niren blinked. That was the first involuntary reaction Selim had gotten from him since he walked in. A single blink of genuine surprise. Gone fast. But there. Whatever's in there, Selim said. You earned the right to hold it. Silence. Real silence. The kind that settles when something shifts and both people in the room feel it at the same time. Niren picked up the key, returned it to his pocket, and leaned back in the chair across the desk with the steady, contained energy of someone who had just registered something. Filed it away and wasn't ready to name it yet. His eyes stayed on Selim's, and what was in them now was not anger, not exhaustion, not even the careful, protective distance he'd walked in with. It was something quieter, and a lot more dangerous to ignore. 3 days passed. Nobody announced it. Nobody marked it. The office operated the way it always had. Phone calls, decisions, people moving in and out of rooms with information and expectations. But inside the structure of it, something had changed its arrangement. Not loudly. Not in a way that anyone on the outside could have named. Niren was there. Not beside Selim. Not beneath him. Not in any of the positions he had occupied before. The quiet background presence, the invisible one, the one people looked through because looking at him meant having to reckon with what he represented. He had a desk now. On the opposite side of the room. Same floor. Different corner. It was Selim's suggestion offered plainly, with no performance around it. Niren had considered it for a long moment. A real moment, not the automatic consideration of someone who'd already decided. And then moved in without comment. They worked in the same space. Separately. That was the thing nobody expected. Not the guards, not the few remaining members of the inner circle who had heard fragments of what happened. Not the people who read the room carefully every morning and tried to understand what version of Selim they were dealing with. They expected tension. Or resolution. One or the other, because those were the two options that made sense. Either these two men were at war, or they'd settled something and moved forward. That was how the world worked in their understanding. Conflict or peace. One of those two things. What they got was neither. What they got was distance. Functional. Deliberate. Maintained by both of them with the kind of care that only exists between people who understand exactly what they're doing and why. Selim sent documents across for review. Niren reviewed them. Sent back notes. Clear, direct, no excess language. Observations that were often sharper than what Selim's remaining team produced. Things that identified leverage points or structural weaknesses that the other analysts had missed or moved past too quickly. Selim read every note twice. He didn't say that. He didn't acknowledge it beyond reading and acting on what was useful. But he read every one twice. Niren, for his part, watched how decisions got made from his new position. Not because he was planning anything, the watching was something else. It was assessment. The ongoing process of a person who had learned not to trust a system until they'd observed it long enough to understand its actual patterns. Not just its stated ones. Sometimes the people don't leave your life. They just stop belonging to you. By the second day, the silence between them had a specific texture. Not uncomfortable. Not cold exactly. More like careful. The way two people move in a kitchen they're not yet sure they're both allowed to use. Every interaction measured. Every exchange landing with a small extra weight that neither of them acknowledged. Selim found himself paying attention to things he normally didn't notice. The exact time Niren arrived in the morning. How he took his coffee, straight, no modification, no ritual around it. The pattern of how he moved through information. Wide first, then deep, then back to the surface to make a decision. The way he held a pen when he was reading something that troubled him. Cap on, pressed lightly against his chin, not writing. These were not things Selim needed to know. He noticed them anyway. On the third afternoon, Niren stood up from his desk and walked to the window. The same window Selim favored. He stood there for 4 minutes without moving, looking out at the city below in the same way Selim had been looking at it for years, like it was a map and he was locating himself on it. Selim watched from across the room and felt, for the first time in a long time, like the room wasn't just his. He wasn't sure how to feel about that. He was sure after a moment that he didn't mind. That evening, late after the building had emptied, Niren came back to his desk and wrote something. Selim was still at his own desk, working through an acquisition file that required his signature. He heard the sound of paper being placed. Looked up. Niren had slid a single sheet across to the edge of his desk, not to Selim's desk, just to the edge of his own, an offering, waiting to be collected or left alone. Selim waited a moment, then stood up, walked across the room and picked it up. It wasn't a proposal, wasn't documentation. It wasn't anything formal or tactical or connected to the work they'd been doing alongside each other for 3 days. It was a question, written in clean, direct handwriting. Do you actually believe the system you built is still worth running? Selim read it. Read it again. Set it down. Looked across the room at Niren, who was watching him with that same contained expression. Present, unreadable, patient as a forecast. Selim picked up a pen. Wrote beneath the question, I believe it was. I'm not sure what it is now. He set it back on the edge of his desk. Niren crossed the room, picked it up, read it, and sat back down at his own desk without comment. But his posture changed. Barely. Just enough. Something in the set of his shoulders settled 1 degree. Like a person who has just received information they needed and are now processing it honestly. Selim returned to his desk. They sat in the same room on opposite sides in the same gold light for another hour. Not talking. Not performing. Just existing in the same space with the same complicated history between them, and neither of them walking away from it. That was something. It wasn't everything, but it was something that hadn't existed 3 days ago. And in this room, in this world, something was how most things started. It happened quietly. No build-up. No scheduled moment. No particular signal that this was the conversation. The real one. The one that everything else had been circling since the doors opened and a briefcase landed on a desk and 2 people began the careful, painful process of existing in the same truth. It was morning. Early. The kind of early when the city outside the window was still deciding what kind of day it wanted to be. Gray light instead of gold. The office smaller feeling, the way rooms feel before the rest of the world fills in around them. Selim was already at his desk. Niren came in and stopped inside the door. Not at his desk. Just stopped. Selim looked up. Niren walked toward him. Not to the chair across the desk. Not to the side table or the window or any of the positions he had occupied over the last several days. He stopped 3 feet from Selim's desk and stood there. No file in hand, no document, nothing to put down or slide across or use as the reason for the approach. Just himself. Standing there. Selim set down what he was holding. The office went the way it went when something important was about to be said. Not louder, not quieter. Just more present. More specific. Like the air adjusted to make room for the weight of it. Niren looked at him for a long moment, and then he said, not with his voice, because his voice had never been the way he communicated what mattered, but with everything in his posture, his face, the set of his eyes, I'm still here, and I need you to understand what that means. Selim understood. He had been understanding it, building toward understanding it for days now. The way Niren showed up, the way he worked, the distance he kept, not because he didn't care, but because caring and trusting were not the same thing, and he had rebuilt himself in such a way that the 2 things were no longer automatically connected. You've been waiting, Selim said. Not a question. Not for the apology. Not for Devon to be removed. He paused. You've been waiting to see what I do when there's nothing left to prove. Niren's eyes stayed on him. Selim stood up. He walked around the desk, not quickly, not with any ceremony, and stopped at the same distance. No desk between them now. Just the room. Just the light. Just the specific weight of 5 years and everything those 5 years had cost both of them in ways they would never fully be able to inventory. I spent 5 years, Selim said, making the same decisions the same way, controlling outcomes, protecting structures, choosing efficiency over instinct. He stopped, and I was good at it. He paused again, longer this time, let the next part breathe before he said it. And I was wrong. In the one moment that mattered more than all of the efficient decisions combined, I was wrong. Niren's chin lifted, just fractionally, listening. I'm not asking you to undo that knowledge, Selim said. I'm not asking you to stop holding the key. I'm not asking you to sit beside me or trust me or call this resolved. He met Niren's eyes fully. I'm asking you to stay in the same room as someone who is trying to be worth the second look. Silence. Full, complete, real silence. The kind that doesn't ask you to fill it. Niren stood in it. He stood in it for a long time. Long enough that the gray light from the window shifted slightly. Long enough that the building around them began to come alive. Distant sounds, an elevator somewhere, the low hum of a city resuming its routines. And then Niren moved. He walked past Selim, past the desk, past the window, and sat down in his chair. His desk, the one across the room. The one that was his now, not borrowed, not temporary. He opened a file, picked up his pen, and before he started reading, he looked up at Selim one more time. His mouth didn't form words, but Selim read it, clearly, without ambiguity. I'll stay. And then, the part that landed heavier than anything else in that room on that morning, the part that Selim would carry with him for a long time, longer than the apology, longer than the relief, longer than anything that had happened in the days since the briefcase came back. Not because I love you. I'm staying to see who you become when I don't. That was it. That was the whole thing. Not reconciliation. Not forgiveness. Not the warm resolution that closes a door and says, "It's over, it's settled, you can stop holding this now." Something harder. Something that asked more. Because staying without forgiveness meant Selim had to earn every day. Not with words. Not with explanations or accountability statements or the right language at the right time. With behavior. With consistency. With the slow, unglamorous, daily work of becoming someone whose decisions, when they mattered, didn't cost someone else 5 years. And Niren, who had survived being discarded, who had built his own case in isolation, who had walked back through those doors carrying proof and patience and absolutely nothing else, was willing to stay long enough to see if that work got done. That was the gift. It didn't feel like a gift. It felt like the most demanding thing anyone had ever placed in Selim's hands. And he held it. Justice doesn't always rebuild what was broken. Sometimes it just shows you exactly what can't be fixed. And who's still standing in the room when that becomes clear. Selim sat back down at his desk, opened his own file, and they worked, on opposite sides of the same room, in the same light, with the same history, and the only sound was the quiet, steady turning of pages, and the world outside the window, carrying on, completely unaware that inside this room, something was being built from the wreckage of something that never should have been destroyed. Slow, precise, one decision at a time. If the story moved something in you, drop it in the comments. Not a reaction, the thought. Because the people who stay when they have every reason to leave are the most complicated, most courageous kind of human beings there are. And they deserve to be seen. If you believe that, share the story with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a story on this channel. Stories that challenge you, stay with you, and remind you that strength doesn't always announce itself. It just shows up, quietly, and keeps coming back.